So I did want to welcome everyone to tonight's Zoom presentation with Marion Blumenthal Lazan. I'm Chris Johnson. I'm the director at the Waterford Public Library. As you can see, if you're already joining us, it's a webinar, so you will be off camera during the presentation. There will be an opportunity at the end if you wish to raise your hand, where we'll be taking questions, and you can unmute yourself with permission at that point, or if you prefer, you can put your questions into the chat and I will ask them for you at the end. I did also want to mention another program that we have this week that may be of interest, and we're doing it in a hybrid format. Thursday evening at 6 p.m. we have Paul Nugent. He's the executive director of the Southeastern Connecticut World Affairs Council, and he'll be speaking on Brexit and its effect specifically on Ireland. So please join us in person at 6 o'clock in the meeting room, or you can visit our website and sign up for the Zoom link there. And just a reminder that we do send out a monthly e-news. There's a link on our website for you to sign up for that e-newsletter so that you can stay informed of all the programs that we have coming up at the library. So as I mentioned, as we're going through the presentation, feel free to put your questions into the chat, or there will be an opportunity at the end. You can raise your hand and we'll unmute you for questions. And without further ado, I shall introduce our speaker. So I'm very pleased this evening to have Marion Blumenthal Lazan joining us live on Zoom. Marion is an author and lecturer who was born in Bremen, Germany, and arrived in the United States at age 13, 3 years after the end of World War II. Marion attended Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois on a scholarship. In her adult life, Marion has worked in the medical field along with much volunteer and community service work. Marion began speaking publicly about her Holocaust experiences in 1979, and her memoir, Perfect Pebbles, which I was planning to hold up, but our copy was checked out and I left my personal copy at home, so I'm sorry about that, was published in 1996. Upwards of 1 million students and adults in schools, organizations, and houses of worship in 38 states, Germany, Holland, Israel, and the UK, have personally heard Marion share her story and messages of tolerance and respect. Marion is a New York State Senate Woman of Distinction. She received the Louis E. Yavner Citizen Award from the New York State Board of Regents for her outreach to schools, religious groups, and civic organizations throughout the US and abroad. Marion and her husband, Nathaniel, who's there somewhere in the background, live on Long Island, and they have 3 married children, 9 beautiful grandchildren, and 7 magnificent great-grandchildren. And personally, I've heard Marion speak twice before and was so moved by her story, her resilience, and her positivity that I felt like I wanted to have her speak for us here in Waterford. And with the current situation in Ukraine, I feel that tonight's presentation couldn't be more timely. So I'm very pleased to present to you Marion Blumenthal Lazan.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine Johnson, for your meaningful and kind introduction. And it is wonderful to see you again, this time on screen. Mm-hmm. And I thank you, of course, for giving me the opportunity to virtually visit with your Waterford community and beyond. I so very much wish that I could be with all of you in person, but since we still have this COVID in our midst, we will use this amazing Zoom technology to connect with one another. This evening, I'm with you all to share my story. It is my childhood experiences during World War II in the concentration camps. I will tell you about our liberation and how we finally started our lives anew in our blessed United States of America. Mine is a story that Anne Frank might have told had she survived. And as most of you know, I think all of you know, Anne Frank was a young Jewish girl who died along with most of her family in a Nazi concentration camp during World War II. This is also a story that conveys a message of perseverance, determination, faith, and above all, hope. Yes, after the presentation, I will be pleased to answer some of your questions. Life in the early 1930s in Germany was very much for my family as it is here for most of you today. Never did we think that the anti-Semitic incidents there would ever lead to very much. My father was in a successful shoe business in a small town. My parents, 2-year older brother and I lived comfortably with my grandparents above the shoe store. Life for Jews was made increasingly more difficult. And in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were formulated and enforced. The following are just some of the many restrictions imposed on the Jews in Germany. Jews were not allowed into theaters, into parks, or into swimming pools. All public schools were closed to Jewish children. Then there was an evening curfew for the Jews. Jews were only allowed to shop during specific hours of the day, and non-Jews were not allowed to shop in Jewish-owned stores. Non-Jews were just not allowed to associate with Jewish people. And then a big letter J for Jew was stamped on ID cards and on passports. These restrictions went on and on. And it was then that my parents decided to make arrangements to leave the country. My grandparents, who were in the late 70s and ill, refused to leave their home. They could not understand the urgency or the necessity of doing so. My grandparents passed away in 1938, just 11 days within each other. And soon thereafter, we received our necessary papers for our immigration to America. I was just 4 years old at that time. November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht or Crystal Night. It was the night of broken glass when the Nazis and their many followers smashed the windows and the storefronts of Jewish-owned stores. Jewish establishments, synagogues, and Jewish books were burned and destroyed. This was the beginning of a massive pogrom against the Jews in Germany, a massive verbal and physical assault against all German Jews. In reality, this was the beginning of the Holocaust. On November 12th, following Kristallnacht, the German government actually fined the Jewish population for the damage caused that night. These imposed taxes were used to rearm Germany. The night of Kristallnacht, our apartment was ransacked. All valuables were thrown into a pillowcase and taken away. But worst of all was that they transported my father to concentration camp Buchenwald in Germany. All sorts of terrible stories were related to my mother, and we did not know if we would ever see my father again. He was released after 3 weeks only because our papers were in order for our immigration to America. And to think that just a few years prior, he had been awarded the Iron Cross for his military service in the German army of World War I. We were forced to sell both our home and our business for a fraction of its worth. And soon thereafter, in January of 1939, we left for Holland, from where we were to sail to the United States. And for almost 9 months, while awaiting our quota number from the American State Department, my parents were assigned to take care of some 125 children. These young children had been sent by their parents from various parts of Europe to escape from the Nazis. In December of that year, 1939, we were deported to the detention camp of Westerbork in Holland to await our departure date to America. Camp Westerbork was constructed by the Dutch to accommodate Jews from various parts of Europe. In May of 1940, just 1 month before our planned departure date, the Germans invaded Holland and we were trapped. All of our belongings, which were about to be loaded on board ship, were burned and destroyed as the harbor of Rotterdam was bombed. Under Dutch control, Camp Westerbork was tolerable, My mother, father, brother, and I shared two small rooms. We all ate in a communal dining room, and at that time there was enough food for us so that we did not go hungry. Adults were assigned to various work duties. My father worked to repair shoes. My mother worked in the kitchen. We children had a makeshift education and lived a very dull, stagnant life. Several months later, when the Nazi SS took over the command of Westerbork, we became acquainted with the ever-present, terrifying 12-foot high barbed wire. And as thousands of Jews were rounded up, many taken from their hiding places, as was Anne Frank and her family, Camp Westerbork became overcrowded. And it was at that time that we had to share our small quarters with another family. And then the dreadful transports to the concentration and extermination camps in Eastern Europe began. This started in early 1942. And from then on, every Monday night, lists of those to be deported were posted, causing incredible anxiety, anguish, and fear. And then on Tuesday mornings, men, women, and little ones were marched to a nearby railroad platform from where they were transported. This area became known as Boulevard de Misère. It was an area of complete misery. At 11 o'clock on Tuesday mornings, the trains left for their destination. And of the total 120,000 men, women, and children that departed Westerbork, 102,000 were doomed never to return. In January of 1944, it was our turn to be shipped out. We children were actually glad for a change of environment. We were very naive and we welcomed the move. We were allowed to take one knapsack each, and whatever we could stuff into it, we were permitted to take. When we approached the railroad platform and we saw the cattle cars in which we were to travel, our fears began to mount. Adults suspected, and they somehow knew what was in store for us. I remember that it was a bitter cold, pitch black, rainy night when we arrived at our destination, concentration camp Bergen-Belsen in Germany. We were pulled and dragged out of the cattle cars and greeted by the German guards who were shouting at us and threatening us with their weapons and with the most vicious attack dogs by their sides. I was a very frightened 9-year-old, and to this day, I still feel a certain sense of fear whenever I see a German Shepherd. Bergen-Belsen was divided into various areas. It was sectioned off and surrounded by electrified barbed wire. Guards were always in strategically placed high guard towers, and in the evenings, as soon as it would turn dark, the bright searchlights from above would constantly sweep the campgrounds. We were placed in a section that was known as the Sternlager, or the Star Camp, named so because we had to continue wearing that yellow star, which had been issued to us back in Holland. Men were on one side of the camp and the women on the other. And this did make it possible at times for families to get a glimpse of one another. We were placed in this particular section of the camp with the hope of being exchanged for German nationals in Palestine, who the British put under house arrest because they were citizens of an enemy country. Unfortunately, that hope never materialized for our family. 600 of us, 600 of our people were crammed into each of the crude, wooden, heatless barracks meant for 100 when originally built. There were triple-decker bunk beds with 2 people sharing each bunk. German winters were bitter cold and very long. We were given only one thin blanket per bunk and a straw-filled mattress. And this bunk was our only living quarters, and that for 2 people. I was very lucky that I was able to share a bunk with my mother and that my brother was able to share a bunk with our father. But can you imagine two adults, two strangers sharing a bunk under such horrendous conditions, a bunk that was no larger than the small cot bed that we're all so familiar with. I remember the first time seeing a wagon filled with what I thought was firewood for the one small oven that we had in our barrack. That oven, of course, was never used. I soon realized that what was in the wagon were dead, naked bodies thrown one on top of the other. Toilets and so-called washing facilities were at a great distance in the most primitive outhouses. Toilets were long wooden benches with holes cut into them, one next to the other. There was no privacy. There was no toilet paper. There was no soap and hardly ever any water with which to wash. And in the almost year and a half that we were in Bergen-Belsen, never once were we able to brush our teeth. There were no trees, no flowers, nor did we ever see a blade of grass. And whenever it rained, we had to slosh through the mud, adding even more misery to our already dismal existence. Every morning, every single morning, without fail, we were ordered to line up on a huge field. It was called an Appellplatz, 5 in a row as we were counted. We would have to stand there until each and every one of us was accounted for, often from early morning till late at night, without food, without water, no matter what the weather, without protective clothing. Frostbite was common. We would treat our affected toes and fingers with the warmth of our own urine. Our diet consisted of a slice of bread a day, some hot watery soup with grizzly meats and turnips and potato peels. The bread was later cut back and given to us just once a week, and only if our so-called quarters were neat and in order. Our birthday present to one another was that little piece of bread that we had saved up from the previous week. Once a month, we were marched to an area to shower, and there, under the watchful eyes of the guards, we were ordered to undress. We had heard about exterminations and gas chambers in other areas of Europe, and we therefore were never sure when the faucets were turned on as to what would come out, water or gas. The Nazis did their utmost to break us physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Unfortunately, they did succeed with many of our people. It was not uncommon for people who were no longer responsible for their actions to attempt escape, even though they knew that their chance to succeed was next to impossible. But they also felt that they had nothing more to lose. The failure of their attempts were obvious when we saw their lifeless bodies hanging electrocuted against the barbed wire. Malnutrition, dysentery, and the loss of the will to go on is what destroyed body and mind. Death was an everyday occurrence. The dark, crowded quarters often caused us to trip and fall over the dead. Bodies could not be taken away fast enough. We as children saw things that no one, no matter what the age, should ever have to see. I know, of course, that you've all heard, you've read, the students who are participating tonight have studied. Many of you have seen movies, perhaps even true documentaries about the Holocaust. But the constant foul odor, the filth, continuous horror and fear surrounded by death is indescribable. There is no way that this can be put accurately into words or pictures. Our bodies, hair, and clothes were infested with lice. We learned that there was a distinct difference between head lice and clothes lice. Squashing them between my thumbnails became my primary pastime. Much of my time was taken up with make-believe games, and one game, a game based on superstition, became very important to me. I decided that if I were to find 4 pebbles of about the same size and shape, that would mean that the 4 members of my family would all survive. My mother, my father, my brother, and I. It was a torturous, painful, very difficult game to play. What if I couldn't find the 3rd or 4th pebble? Might that mean that 1 or 2 of my family members would not pull through? Nevertheless, this game gave me something to hold on to, some distant hope. After a number of months on our meager diets, our stomach shrunk so that the hunger was no longer painful. Teenagers and men suffered most from malnutrition and were the first to die. Those who lasted the longest were the women, and mothers in particular. It was their strong will to keep their children alive that kept them going. And my mother was one of those remarkable ladies. There is no doubt in my mind that it was my mother's inner strength and fortitude that finally saw us through. One day, my mother was able to smuggle some potatoes and some salt from the kitchen where she worked, and somehow managed to cook some soup in secret. This was done on our bunk. I was on the bunk with her, trying to hide and shield what she was doing. Soup was simmering, just about finished, when the German guards entered our barrack for surprise inspection. In our rush to hide that setup, the boiling soup spilled on my leg. We had been taught self-discipline and self-control the hard way, for I knew for sure, had I cried out, it would have cost us our lives. This happened in the spring of 1945. I was just 10 years old. The population in Camp Bergen-Belsen were dying off rapidly, but not nearly fast enough to satisfy the Nazis. Several weeks later, it was decided to send 3 trainloads of our people to the eastern part of Europe and towards the extermination camps and the gas chambers. We did not know that Auschwitz with its gas chambers had already been liberated. My family was among the 2,500 on the last of these 3 trains. It was April of 1945. Russian army was closing in from the northeast, and the British and the Americans from the west. Under normal conditions, this train ride from Bergen-Belsen to whatever area of Eastern Europe they were going to send us would have taken no more than 10 hours. But because the Germans tried to evade the Allies, we were en route for 2 long weeks without food, without water, without medical supplies, without sanitary facilities. That meant no toilets. Whenever the train came to a stop, those who were able and those who were strong enough were permitted to get out and take a drink from a nearby stream or dig up roots to eat. My mother remembered taking some sort of a pot and collecting water from the locomotive, and who knows what else that pot was used for. The need for water at that time was almost more important than food because of the severe dehydration due to the dysentery and the high fever due to the typhus. Let me briefly explain typhus. It is a highly contagious, deadly disease that's caused from filth and spread by lice. At the same time, while the train was at a standstill, the newly dead were taken off and buried along the tracks. In addition, our train was subject to frequent air attacks by the Allies. It is truly remarkable how any one of us was able to survive under such horrendous conditions. In fact, 500 of our people, that's 1 out of every 5, died en route or shortly thereafter. My burnt leg was severely infected, and it was impossible to keep the wound clean or lice-free. In late April, after 14 days of this surreal and horrifying journey, the German guards stormed frantically through the train, seeking civilian clothing so that they would not be recognized by the Allies. And we knew then that the war was coming to an end. It was the Russian army that liberated our train and led us to a nearby farm village in eastern Germany. Most of the inhabitants had fled, and we took over their homes. Kitchens were stocked with ample food. It was rich and good, actually much too good for our starved bodies. We could not tolerate that unfamiliar nourishment. And at that time, at the age of 10 and a half, I weighed 16 kilos, or as we know it here, 35 pounds. And my mother weighed a mere 70 pounds. The Russians, in a crude way, tried to help us the best that they could. I was brought to a nearby clinic for medical attention. My leg was in very bad condition, and I was close to losing it. Fortunately, it was decided to treat the wound, and I was very lucky that my leg responded to medications and it gradually healed. As I regained my strength, I also learned to walk. And in the interim, our heads were shaved because that was the only way that we could rid ourselves of head lice. Although we were all weak, ill, and thoroughly exhausted, I vividly remember the spring of 1945. The weather was beautiful, sunny and bright. Trees and grass were lush and green. Flowers were in bloom. Birds were singing. It was a wonderful, exciting feeling to be free at long last. We were all ill with typhus, but my father had to die from it 6 weeks after our liberation. And this after 6.5 years of mental torment and physical abuse. My 12-year-old brother, Albert, actually helped bury our father. When I talk about those years, it is as though I'm relating a nightmare, a very bad dream. I separate myself from it ever having happened to me, and that is how I deal with it. It is a wonderful story of how we gradually recuperated and were sent back to Holland to start our lives anew. My brother and I were eventually placed in a children's home in preparation to live in what was then British mandated Palestine, and we know today as Israel. Most of the children in this home survived alone without their parents. I felt like a total misfit. I needed to learn how to resettle into a normal society. Had no training for that. Here I was, by this time, 11 years old. I had never been in a store. I had no idea what money was all about, had almost no table manners. It was like learning to live all over again. It was in this home that we became reacquainted with life in its normal state. Meals served us were delicious and nourishing, and you can imagine that just about anything and everything tasted good to us. And though our surrogate parents provided a very strict environment, much love and care were given us. I began my first formal education at that time at the age of 11 and a half. We were taught the secular subjects, reading, writing, arithmetic, in a Montessori school where we progressed at our own pace. The Dutch language in which we were taught was all new to us. We also received a thorough education in Hebrew and in religious studies. The British, who were governing Palestine in the 1940s, had issued what was known as the White Paper, restricting the number of Jews permitted into the land. And they were intercepting many of the refugee ships and interning the survivors on the island of Cyprus, and in some cases, turning the ships back to Europe. In November of 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine between Arabs and Jews, which in May of 1948 led to the establishment of the State of Israel. In 1947, just 1 year prior to Israel becoming a state, our illegal voyage from Holland to Palestine was planned, and danger once again loomed over us. And because parents at that time were not permitted to accompany their children, my mother managed to make arrangements for a family of 3 to emigrate to the United States. And thanks to the Holland America line, we were able to use the tickets which had been purchased 10 years earlier. We arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey, April 23rd, 1948, by coincidence, exactly 3 years to the day of our liberation. It was a Jewish relief organization, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, that found a home for us in Peoria, Illinois. I had never heard of Illinois, definitely not Peoria. And there, at the age of 13, I once again started life anew in a strange land and again learning a new language, my third new language in less than 3 years. First Dutch, then Hebrew, and now English. And because of my inability to speak English, I, at the age of 13, was placed in the fourth grade with 9-year-olds. Although both my brother and I worked long hours after school to help our mom pay bills, I nevertheless found time. I actually made time to take extra courses during the year, attend summer school, and by working very hard in my studies, I was able to be graduated from Peoria Central High School 5 years later at age 18, ranking 8th in a class of 267 students. It was 2 months after high school graduation that I was married to Nathaniel Lazan, who I had met at the age of 16 in Peoria. And God willing, we'll be celebrating our 69th wedding anniversary this coming August. Nathaniel, come over here for a minute and say hello to these nice people in Connecticut and wherever. This is Nathaniel. Okay.
You want to introduce your great granddaughter?
Not yet. I will shortly. I am grateful. I am very grateful that I survived healthy in body, mind, and spirit, and that together with my husband, I'm able to perpetuate my heritage with a wonderful family. We have 3 grown children and 9 wonderful grandchildren and 7 absolutely magnificent great-grandchildren, one of who, our eldest great-granddaughter, Leah Tova, is right here, and this is she. I'm so glad you're here tonight. It's the first time that she's ever heard me. Thank you for being here. And in March of 1996, my memoir, For Perfect Pebbles, co-authored by Lila Pearl, was published by Green Willow Division of HarperCollins. It is now in its 34th printing in hardback. HarperCollins decided to do a 20th anniversary edition, and this is it with this cover that I can't help it, but I really don't like it. And I know it's because of this barbed wire, it really bothers me, but they were in charge, and so that was it. And Scholastic Book Club has made it available since 1999, has been translated into German, into Dutch, and it came out in Hebrew. Yad Vashem, that's a Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, published it in Hebrew. They did a super job on it. And if you like, you may all read it in Japanese. Maybe there's someone in the audience who can do just that. But above all, I am so grateful that the story is in book form so that it can be passed on to future generations. And I'm thrilled that a documentary has been made entitled Marion's Triumph, with the actress Deborah Messing as the narrator. So you see that despite all the terrible things that happened to me as a child, my life today is full and rewarding. Although I've spoken to upward of 1.5 million adults and students over the past 25 years or so, it still has not become easy. However, I do realize the importance of sharing that period of our history with you, simply because in a few short years, we will not be here any longer to give a first-hand account. When I speak to students, I tell them it is their generation that is the very last generation that will hear these stories firsthand. And I therefore ask them to please share my story or any of the Holocaust stories that they read and hear about. Please share them with their friends and with their relatives. And someday they should share them with their children, and yes, even with their grandchildren. When we're not here any longer, it's today's generation that will have to bear witness. As difficult as it is, the horror of the Holocaust must be taught, must be studied, and kept alive. Only then can we guard it from ever happening again. This is the very yellow star that I was forced to wear. It says Jude, which in German means Jew. It was just another way to denigrate us, to isolate us, and to set us apart from the rest of society. This represents a Star of David, a beautiful, meaningful Jewish symbol. But the Nazis made it so very ugly. Each of us, each and every one of us must do everything in our power to prevent such hatred, such destruction, and such terror from reoccurring. And we can begin by having love, respect, and tolerance towards one another, regardless of the religious belief, regardless of the color of our skin, regardless of the national origin. This respect towards one another must begin in our homes, around the kitchen table, dining room table, wherever we gather as a family. We, the adults, must pass it on our places of business. The students must pass it on in their classrooms, the halls of their school, communities, towns, cities, and only if there is respect and tolerance and compassion towards one another in the countries can we expect to have peace in the world. We must begin with our children. Let us treat people as individuals. Let us look for similarities and respect the differences. Let us build bridges and reach out towards one another. And we must be true to ourselves and not blindly follow a leader without thinking ahead and searching our hearts and our minds as to what the consequences might be. When I speak to the students, I tell them it is not cool to follow just anyone's lead without first checking to see what his or her true intentions are. We are all aware, or we should be, that 6 million Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust. 6 million. Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, has a population of a bit over 3 million. Can you possibly imagine almost twice the population of Connecticut wiped out? The 6 million also represent 1/3 of the entire pre-World War II Jewish population. Among them were 1.5 million children. We also need to remember that there were 5 million non-Jews who lost their lives. Among them were the righteous Gentiles, as we refer to them, very special people, non-Jews who jeopardized their lives to save Jewish families. That would hide them in the attics, that would hide them in the basements. Farmers would hide them out in the barns, that were hidden in convents. And when these good people were caught doing what they felt was the right thing to do, they also were deported to concentration camps, and in many cases lost their lives. And that brings me to another message. We must never generalize and judge an entire group by the actions of some within that group. These are all universal messages that each and every one of us is familiar with to varying degrees, but need to be reminded of over and over again. And this certainly was a good opportunity to do so. These messages are the lessons learned from that dark period of our history, and certainly apply to today's world situation and definitely to our own individual lives. By listening, I hope that our young people prevent our past from becoming their future. I'd like to share something with you about an extraordinary special lady. Need a sip first. My mother. Whoops. This was my mother on her 104th birthday. An amazing, magnificent, beautiful lady. Mom passed away a few years ago. Before she passed away, we were 5 generations of women, with Leah Tova making it the 5th generation. And I always refer to that as survival and continuity. Amazing. She was just a wise, beautiful lady. And there were 2 things that my mom demanded of my brother and me when we first came to America. Number 1, learn English, learn it quickly. Number 2, work as hard as you can in school and at work in order to succeed. My mom was 40 years old when she came to America, 40, knew absolutely no English, learned to read, write, and speak a magnificent English. She was outstanding and a fabulous, wonderful, wonderful mother-in-law to Nathaniel, and he was an extraordinary son-in-law to my mom. 2 very, very, very special people, for sure. My brother, Albert, passed away a few years ago. He dealt with this altogether differently than I did. He did not talk about it as freely as you heard it from me this evening. Was happily married, lived in California, but by choice did not bring children into this world and had a very difficult time with organized religion. All of that made me very sad. But I didn't fault Albert. We have to remember he was 2 years older than I am, was with my father in the men's section, and I'm convinced that he saw and experienced things that I did not. God puts us on this earth, gives us a beautiful mind. It is this mind that allows us to choose right from wrong, good from evil. Therefore, men did this towards one another. But did he have to make it so bitterly cold when we were standing out there on the Pell all day? I have a direct line. I ask loads of questions. Don't get too many answers, but that's okay. Faith I will always have. After all, here I am, 3 children, 9 grandchildren, 7 great-grandchildren, from whom generations will be forthcoming. He made sure that enough of us survived so that we will always be here. I am proud of my faith, as I'm certain you in the audience are proud of your faith and of your heritage. But please, please, let us all remember to respect the right of others to their belief. Be kind and good and respectful and compassionate towards one another. That is the basis for peace. Had there been respect and tolerance towards one another some 75 years ago, I would not be here with you this evening to share that dark period of our history. 9/11 would not have occurred. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, North Korea, Ukraine, Russia, all these countries that are in such turmoil would be peaceful countries for its people. Be kind and good and respectful towards one another, please. There is very little that we can do against the negativity in our world, but how we treat, behave, and reach out towards one another, that is entirely up to us. Did I ever find my 4 pebbles? It's a frequently asked question. I always found my 4 pebbles. I made it my business to find them. I cheated all the time. When I found them, I put them in the safe place. Next time I would search for them. I couldn't find the 3rd one or the 4th one. I knew exactly where to go and pick them up. Maybe that was cheating, but it was my game, and guess who made the rules? You need to know that I was only about 9 or 10 years old when things were at its absolute worst. We had nothing to occupy our time with constructively. No paper, no pencils, no books, certainly no games. So I was so lucky to have such an imaginative mind. And my imaginative games were always based on a positive attitude. I would search for a piece of glass or a piece of a mirror whatever I could find on that dirt ground in Bergen-Belsen. And when the sun would shine, which didn't happen nearly often enough in that part of Germany, known for bad weather and cloudy skies, but I, Marion, knew that that sun would always come out. And when it did, that little piece of glass would cast a reflection onto the ground. And that little wiggly reflection, it became my pet. As long as the sun would shine, I would have my pet, and my pet would never, ever die. I would also imagine that one day I once again would have my 3 Bs. And these 3 Bs represented our everyday comforts and necessities that we all take so much for granted. First B represented a bed. I knew that someday I once again would have my very own bed with a real mattress, clean sheets, and enough blankets to keep me warm. Second B represented a bath, warm water, soap, clean towels, and with that would come toothpaste and a toothbrush, of course. And the third B was bread. I knew that someday I once again would have enough bread so that I would never again go hungry. These imaginative games, if you will, were my survival techniques. They were my survival skills. Do you know that we all have survival techniques and skills within us? When the need arises, we just have to search for them, find them, and be sure that we put them to work. No one is spared adversity. No one is spared hardship. We all have to overcome obstacles at one time or another, but with perseverance, with determination, with faith, and above all hope, one can overcome just about anything and everything. Above all, never, ever give up hope. It is not so much what happens to a person, it's how we deal with the situation that makes the difference. I don't know, should I share about the potato chips? No, maybe not. Are there students in the audience, Mrs. Johnson? Are the students in? Maybe.
There may be some, yes. I mean, we did say it was for 12 and up.
Okay, all right. So we'll share this part also. When I came to America, I got acquainted with potato chips. And whoever was eating them was dipping in something white and creamy. I didn't know from dips, so I was so sure it was mayonnaise. Well, I couldn't wait to get my own big bag of potato chips and my own jar of mayonnaise. And I did that do a job on me. I very quickly became a big 13-year-old. And remember, there I was with these little 9-year-olds. You know, that could have made plenty fun of me. I looked differently, certainly acted differently, but I need you to know they were so good to me. They helped me with my homework, included me in their games. I hope that the students who are listening in tonight will also, when a new person comes into their community, to be kind and good to them. Put yourselves in their place, how you might feel if you're placed in a strange or new environment. Be good and kind and compassionate and helpful towards one another, please. Nathaniel's from New York. He went to Bradley University in Peoria, lucky me. He went home on vacations, and way back then in the 1950s, long distance telephone calls were very expensive. There were, of course, no computers and no emails and no texting, but there was such a thing as a 3-cent stamp. And with this 3-cent stamp, we would write to one another every single day. Major problems. In his letters to me, he would add 5 words. There were 10 words, Lazan. Anyway, lots of words, way too many words that he asked me to define and put into a sentence. That was a lot of nerve with all I had to do, but I knew he meant to help me with my English, and I guess it did work. So, Nathaniel, I thank you once again.
It was my pleasure, Marion.
And I, on the other hand, would write my letters in rough draft with a dictionary by my side. And only when I felt that it was always in rough draft. And only when I felt that the letter was worth sending to him, I would do so. Otherwise, no way would I send my letters to Nathaniel. without checking them over and over again. We traveled to Germany on various occasions, about a total of 8 times. And the very first time was back in 1995. It was the 50th anniversary of our liberation. And we visited my father's grave. And the reason my father and about 60 others have a private resting place in that farm village where we were liberated was because they died after some of the chaos had subsided. Those who died early on were all buried in mass graves. We also went to Bergen-Belsen, and Bergen-Belsen looks nothing the way I remembered it. It had been burned down under the direction of President Eisenhower, who was then the commander of the Allied forces, because the conditions of the camp would have created tremendous health hazards for the entire region of Germany. So today, other than the newly built documentation and exhibition centers, Bergen-Belsen looks like a park, green grass, shrubs, trees, not bad looking at all, except for the mounds everywhere, mounds with plaques that read, "Here lie 1,000, here lie 2,500. These are the mass graves of our people. We also went to my former hometown of Hoya near Hanover. And there we were greeted by public officials who apologized over and over again for what was done to us back then. And then there was a young couple born after the war, not Jewish, who took us to the Jewish cemetery, which was in terrible disarray, had not been cared for since 1938. Took us to our family plot, and there, among the toppled over stones, was a brand new shiny granite footstone with the inscription: Zur Erinnerung an die zerstörte Grabstelle der Familie Blumenthal, Hoja 1894 bis 1938. In memory of the desecrated plot of the Blumenthal family, Hoya 1894 to 1938, placed there by this non-Jewish young couple, unbeknownst to us, a most generous, kind gesture. Never thought I would refer to non-Jewish Germans in such glowing terms. It's people like these that renew one's faith in humanity, and they've become dear, dear friends of ours. And whenever we returned, I speak in schools, university, in churches, do so in German. Very difficult for these young people to hear. After all, it happened in their country by their own grandparents and great-grandparent generation. It's a huge, huge burden for these young people, and it will be their burden, unfortunately, for generations to come. We returned at one point, it was in 2010, because a brand new public high school in my former hometown was named in my honor. So now we have the Marion Blumenthal Oberschule in Hoya. Tremendous celebration and very courageous for this little town to redress what happened so many years ago in their midst. And the night before the celebration, we commemorated the night of broken glass on the site where our synagogue once stood. Difficult trips for sure, but no regrets having returned. You need to know, I do want to add this to let you know that Germany is doing everything in its power to continually remind its people as to what happened during that war, dreadful war. And it's, for one thing, it is mandatory for the subject to be taught in their schools. And they can come up with all kinds of ways to continually remind the population. For one thing, there is such a thing as ein Stolperstein, a stumbling block. You don't stumble over it. It is a metal plaque that's deeply embedded in the sidewalk in front of the home where the person once lived and never returned. And on that plaque is engraved his or her name, date of birth, where, when, and how he or she died. And there are other various ways for them, and they continue to come up with something different to remind its people. Mind you, this is 75, 80 years ago, but they don't give in and they don't give up to remind his people. And that's to be commendable for sure. Before I wind down, I will be glad to answer some questions. Ms. Johnson, are there any questions? I know I covered a lot, quite a bit.
Well, we do have one in the chat, and then if anybody, you can use the raise hand option, and I can have you unmute if you want to ask a question. But let me ask the one that's in the chat. It's from Carrie. And it's, do you ever wonder what would have happened if your parents left before everything happened?
I would not be with you this evening, for sure. That's right. We would have been saved such a miserable, miserable life. And life would have been altogether different, altogether. But I'm so grateful that I did survive. And I'm so very, very grateful that I have the ability and that I'm willing to share the story and that I'm given the opportunity like this evening to share and to educate, if you will, to the audience. Okay.
Anyone? Oh, I see a hand raised. Let's see. When is that you, Aaron? Let's see, Aaron.
Hi, this was a beautiful, well-spoken, very moving talk. My question for you, Marion, is, as you may know, in some of the public schools and libraries in the United States, there seems to be an effort to protect students, but unfortunately what they're doing is removing some of the stories that enlighten people about what really happened. For example, the book Mouse has been taken out of the curriculum and even libraries in Tennessee. Have you experienced any of that kind of attitude toward your work and your talks?
Never, ever once. I have about another, I think about 25 presentations from now until the middle of June. Kentucky, Oklahoma, Illinois, where else, Nathaniel? I mean, in so many areas. And for them, and in a sense, they're trying to deny that this has happened, save their students from hearing these stories. It's like denying the Civil War. This is history, unfortunately, but this is history. And it's regrettable that all of a sudden they're trying to, there must be somebody behind this. And it's upsetting, certainly it's upsetting. This is history, and students and audiences of all ages need to hear about it and need to learn from it for sure. Yeah.
I actually have a question, if I may, Marion. I'm sure you're familiar with the story that was on 60 Minutes, where they are doing the holograms of Holocaust survivors. Have you shared your story, or will you be sharing your story in that way?
I have not been approached, so I certainly would be willing, but have not been approached.
Really?
Nope,
Right, so
not
it's
as
the
yet.
Shoah Foundation.
But that's,
We did do the Shoah Foundation.
oh, well, yeah, but that's different. Nathaniel just reminded me, I was very involved in the Shoah Foundation, whereby they interviewed some, oh my goodness, 350,000, I don't know, thousands survivors. And that was back in, that was Steven Spielberg's project, if you will. And it was quite amazing. And I was interviewed by someone who was there was an interviewer, there was an audio person, there was a video person, and they were now home from 3 o'clock in the afternoon till 11 o'clock at night.
Wow.
So it was amazing, exhausting, but very important. And all these interviews are digitized and made available in at least 5 well-known Holocaust museums worldwide.
Wonderful. Yeah.
For sure.
Are there any other questions? I don't see any hands raised or anything in the chat.
Yeah.
No, I guess your story was very, very, very complete and very compelling.
September 11th, 2001. That's a date none of us will ever forget as long as we live. At that time, Nathaniel and I were in Florida visiting children and grandchildren. And because all planes were grounded, we chose to drive home. And as we approached New York and crossed the Bergen-Belsen Bridge, amidst the smoking ruins of the Twin Towers, we could see the Statue of Liberty holding high the torch of freedom. It is that flame of freedom that the terrorists sought to destroy, but could not. Let us all, each and every one of us, redouble our efforts to be kind and good and respectful towards one another. And with that, I wish each and every one of you, your children, your grandchildren, and all succeeding generations, a healthy, happy, productive future in a world of love and peace. And I thank you, Mrs. Johnson, for giving me this opportunity this evening to reach out to so many.
And speaking on behalf of Waterford, we thank you very much for sharing your story as well. And I know it's painful, but it is important, and we're glad that you're doing it.
Thank you.
And have a happy Passover.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You all have a happy Passover, and I hope you had an enjoyable Easter. And I wish I could be with you all to give hugs. Consider yourself hugged. And thank you so much.
All right. Thank you again. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.